The war was supposed to last weeks. That was the promise many Americans believed in during the terrifying days after the attacks of September 11th, 2001. The mission sounded simple: hunt down the people responsible, destroy the terrorist network hiding in the mountains of Afghanistan, bring justice, then leave. But America did not leave. Weeks became months. Months became years. And before the world fully realized what had happened, an entire generation had grown up during a war that seemed to have no ending. Children born after September 11th were old enough to join the military and fight in the very same conflict that had started before they could even speak. 20 years, thousands of American soldiers dead, hundreds of thousands of Afghan lives shattered, trillions of dollars vanished. And then, in 2021, the world watched a shocking scene unfold. Helicopters hovered above rooftops in Kabul. Crowds flooded the airport. Desperate civilians clung to military aircraft. The Taliban, the very group America had spent 2 decades fighting, returned to power almost overnight. For many people watching from home, one question suddenly became impossible to ignore. What was the point of it all? How did the most powerful military on earth become trapped in a war it could not truly win? And why did the United States remain in Afghanistan for 20 long years when officials privately admitted again and again that victory was slipping away? The answer is more complicated and more disturbing than most people realize. Because this was never just a war about terrorism. Behind the speeches, behind the flags, behind the promises of freedom and democracy, there existed another story. A story of fear, politics, pride, intelligence failures, shifting goals, hidden agendas, and impossible decisions. A story where leaving became more dangerous politically than staying. A story where every president inherited a conflict nobody knew how to end. And a story where the definition of victory kept changing until nobody could explain what winning even meant anymore. This is the untold story behind America's longest war. The story of how the United States entered Afghanistan with overwhelming confidence and slowly became trapped inside history itself. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, America believed it was safe. Then, within hours, that illusion collapsed. For hijacked airplanes, 2 towers destroyed, the Pentagon burning, nearly 3,000 people dead. The attacks carried out by Al-Qaeda shocked the United States in a way few events ever had. Americans were not simply grieving. They were terrified, angry, humiliated. For the first time in modern history, the country felt vulnerable on its own soil. And almost immediately, attention turned toward Afghanistan. At the time, Afghanistan was controlled by the Taliban, an Islamist regime that had ruled much of the country since the 1990s. The Taliban had allowed Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden to operate training camps inside Afghanistan. To American leaders, the message was simple. If the Taliban refused to hand over bin Laden, they would become the enemy too. President George W. Bush delivered an ultimatum. The Taliban refused. And within less than a month after September 11th, the United States launched war. At first, the invasion appeared incredibly successful. American air power devastated Taliban positions. CIA teams coordinated with anti-Taliban militias known as the Northern Alliance. Special forces moved rapidly across the country. Within weeks, Taliban fighters were retreating. Kabul fell. The regime collapsed. And many officials in Washington believed the mission was nearly complete. But that assumption would become one of the greatest miscalculations in modern American history. Because while the Taliban lost control of cities, they did not disappear. They escaped. Many crossed into neighboring Pakistan. Others blended back into villages and mountain regions. America had removed a government, but it had not destroyed the movement itself. In the chaos that followed, another dangerous idea quietly emerged inside Washington. If America could remove the Taliban this quickly, maybe it could rebuild Afghanistan too. That single belief would transform a short military operation into a 20-year nation-building experiment nobody fully understood. At first, the goals sounded clear. Destruir al-Qaeda, capture or kill Osama bin Laden, prevent another terrorist attack. But by 2002, the mission was already evolving. American officials started talking about democracy, women's rights, education, elections, infrastructure, a new Afghanistan. The United States was no longer simply fighting terrorists. It was attempting to reshape an entire country after decades of war, corruption, tribal conflict, and foreign invasions. And Afghanistan was one of the hardest places on earth to control. Empires had failed there for centuries. The British struggled in the 19th century. The Soviet Union became trapped there during the 1980s in a brutal conflict that drained resources and morale. Afghanistan's geography alone was a nightmare. Rugged mountains, remote villages, Ashtihan, weak central government, deep tribal loyalties. But despite these warnings, Washington believed America could succeed where others had failed. Why? Because after the rapid fall of the Taliban, confidence in U.S. military power was soaring. Officials believed technology, intelligence, and money could overcome history. They underestimated how complicated Afghanistan truly was. And perhaps most importantly, they underestimated how long the war would last. One of the biggest problems facing the United States was that the Taliban did not fight like a traditional army. They adapted. Instead of defending cities, they launched insurgencies. Roadside bombs, ambushes, hit and run attacks, suicide bombing. Then they disappeared into mountains or across borders. American troops could win battles and still lose control once they left an area. This created a devastating cycle. The U.S. military would clear Taliban fighters from a region. Officials would declare progress. Troops would move elsewhere. Then the Taliban would quietly return. Again and again and again. The war became less about defeating an enemy and more about managing instability. Meanwhile, Pakistan complicated everything. American intelligence believed Taliban leaders were using safe havens inside Pakistani territory to regroup and organize. But Pakistan was also officially a U.S. ally. This created enormous tension. America depended on Pakistan for logistics and regional cooperation. Yet many officials privately believed parts of Pakistan's security establishment were helping Taliban elements survive. It was like trying to fight a fire while someone kept reopening the fuel line. And every year the war continued, the Taliban gained something incredibly valuable: time. One of the strangest aspects of the Afghanistan war was how invisible it became to many Americans. In the early years after September 11th, the conflict dominated headlines. But eventually, public attention faded. Why? Because daily life inside the United States largely continued uninterrupted. There was no military draft. Most Americans had no direct connection to the fighting. A small percentage of military families carried the burden repeatedly through multiple deployments. Meanwhile, news coverage shifted elsewhere. Then came another massive turning point. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq. Suddenly, Afghanistan was no longer Washington's primary focus. Resources, political attention, intelligence capabilities, and military planning shifted toward Baghdad. Some analysts later argued this became a critical mistake. While America concentrated on Iraq, the Taliban quietly rebuilt strength in Afghanistan. Insurgency networks expanded. Corruption inside the Afghan government worsened. And the war that initially looked won slowly transformed into something much darker. A forever war. As years passed, one issue kept destroying American progress in Afghanistan: corruption. The Afghan government, backed by the United States, struggled with bribery, fraud, weak institutions, and political infighting. Billions of dollars flowed into the country, but enormous amounts disappeared. Some projects were abandoned. Others existed only on paper. American officials often found themselves supporting local power brokers accused of corruption because they needed allies against the Taliban. This created a painful contradiction. The United States claimed it was building democracy and stability, but many ordinary Afghans viewed their own government as dishonest or disconnected from reality. And when civilians lose faith in government, insurgent movements gain opportunity. The Taliban exploited this frustration skillfully. They portrayed themselves as defenders against foreign occupation and corrupt elites. Even Afghans who disliked Taliban ideology sometimes distrusted the government even more. That reality terrified American planners, because counterinsurgency wars are not won purely through military strength. They are won through legitimacy. And legitimacy was collapsing. One of the most extraordinary aspects of the conflict was how it stretched across 4 American presidencies. George W. Bush started the war. Barack Obama expanded it. Donald Trump negotiated withdrawal plans. Joe Biden ended it. And each president faced the same terrifying dilemma: leave and risk Afghanistan collapsing, or stay and continue an endless war. No option looked good. Bush initially believed victory was achievable. Obama entered office criticizing the Iraq War, but describing Afghanistan as the necessary war. He authorized a massive troop surge, hoping increased military pressure could stabilize the country. For a time, troop levels exceeded 100,000. But even with overwhelming military power, the core problems remained unresolved. Trump later pushed negotiations with the Taliban, signaling America's desire to exit. Then Biden made the final decision to withdraw completely. Each administration inherited promises made by the previous one, and each discovered how difficult it was to escape. Because the longer America stayed, the more dangerous leaving appeared. In 2011, the United States achieved one of its original objectives. Osama bin Laden was killed during a U.S. raid in Pakistan. For many Americans, the moment felt symbolic. Justice, closure, victory. But it also created an uncomfortable question. If the mastermind behind 9/11 was dead, why was the war still continuing? The answer revealed how dramatically the mission had changed. The war was no longer only about al-Qaeda. Now, it was about preventing Afghanistan from collapsing into chaos, preventing terrorist resurgence, protecting the Afghan government, maintaining regional stability, defending gains for women and education. The objectives had multiplied, and the more goals America added, the harder success became to define. Years later, investigative reports and leaked interviews painted an alarming picture. Behind closed doors, many officials privately admitted the war was going badly. Some confessed they did not fully understand Afghanistan. Others admitted progress reports were often overly optimistic. Statistics were manipulated. Success was exaggerated. Failures were hidden. Publicly, leaders spoke about momentum and stability. Privately, many feared the war had no clear path to victory. This disconnect deeply damaged public trust once exposed, because Americans realized something painful. The war had continued not because leaders were confident of success, but because nobody wanted to be blamed for losing. To many observers, the obvious question became, why didn't the United States simply withdraw earlier? The answer involved fear. Fear that Afghanistan would collapse in a civil war. Fear terrorist groups would return. Fear allies would lose trust in America. Fear of political backlash inside Washington. Fear that sacrifices already made would feel meaningless. There was also another powerful psychological factor, the sunk cost effect. After investing thousands of lives and trillions of dollars, leaders struggled to accept failure. Instead of asking whether the war could truly be won, officials often focused on avoiding immediate disaster. So the mission continued, year after year, administration after administration. In 2021, the end finally arrived. American forces withdrew, and almost immediately, Afghan security forces began collapsing far faster than many intelligence estimates predicted. The speed shocked the world. Scenes from Kabul airport became global symbols of desperation and chaos. For critics, the withdrawal looked catastrophic. For supporters, it represented the painful but necessary end to an unwinnable war. But perhaps the most haunting part was this. After 20 years of fighting, the Taliban returned to power anyway. The very outcome America spent decades trying to prevent had happened. And suddenly, people everywhere were asking the same question. Did the United States actually lose the war? Even now, the answer remains deeply controversial. Some argue America succeeded in preventing another 9/11-style attack from Afghanistan for 2 decades. Others believe the war exposed the limits of military power. The conflict changed global politics, intelligence operations, surveillance systems, military strategy, and public trust in government. It reshaped an entire generation of veterans. It transformed Afghanistan forever. And it revealed something uncomfortable about modern warfare. The strongest military in the world can destroy governments, but rebuilding nations is far more difficult, especially when history, culture, tribal dynamics, corruption, and political reality collide. For many Americans, the Afghanistan war existed only on television screens. But for soldiers, it became a repeating cycle that consumed entire lives. Deploy, return home, recover, deploy again. Some troops served multiple tours across different provinces, watching the same regions fall into violence over and over again. Villages cleared one year could become Taliban territory the next. Roads once considered safe suddenly turned deadly overnight. And perhaps the most psychologically exhausting part was this. Many soldiers no longer understood what winning meant. At the beginning of the war, morale had been fueled by anger after September 11th. Troops believed they were hunting terrorists responsible for the deadliest attack in American history. But years later, younger soldiers arrived in Afghanistan who had been children when the war started. Some barely remembered 9/11 at all. Yet they were risking their lives in a conflict that seemed trapped in endless repetition. Veterans later described a strange, emotional contradiction. On one hand, they believed deeply in protecting each other and completing missions. On the other hand, many privately questioned whether the larger strategy made sense anymore. The emotional scars became enormous. Thousands returned home struggling with trauma, depression, and PTSD. Others carried guilt over friends who never made it back. And while politicians debated strategy in Washington, military families quietly endured the human cost year after year. The war had become personal for them in a way most civilians could never fully understand. To many outsiders, It seemed impossible that the Taliban could survive against the military power of the United States. America possessed drones, satellites, advanced aircraft, elite special forces, and some of the most sophisticated intelligence systems in history. The Taliban often relied on motorcycles, hidden explosives, and guerrilla tactics. Yet despite this imbalance, they endured. Why? Because the Taliban understood something America struggled to accept. They did not need to defeat the United States militarily. They only needed to outlast it. For Taliban fighters, Afghanistan was home. For American soldiers, deployments eventually ended. The Taliban could disappear into rural areas, blend into local populations, wait patiently, and strike again later. Time itself became their weapon, and as years passed, Taliban propaganda evolved carefully. They portrayed themselves not merely as extremists, but as resistance fighters battling foreign occupation. That narrative resonated with some Afghans who were angry over civilian casualties, corrupt officials, or foreign military presence. Meanwhile, every accidental airstrike that harmed civilians created new resentment. Every night, raid gone wrong created new fear. Every broken promise we can trust. The Taliban exploited every mistake relentlessly, and slowly, they rebuilt influence across large parts of the country. Not always because people loved them, but because many people no longer believed the Afghan government or its foreign backers could truly protect them. The financial cost alone became staggering. Over time, the Afghanistan war consumed trillions of dollars. The United States funded military operations, reconstruction projects, intelligence programs, weapons systems, humanitarian efforts, and Afghan security forces. Entire industries grew around the war. Defense contractors profited enormously. Private security companies expanded. Massive logistical operations stretched across continents. Yet despite the enormous spending, many projects failed spectacularly. Some schools were abandoned. Some buildings collapsed from poor construction. Some military equipment disappeared. In certain areas, American-funded infrastructure barely survived after foreign forces left. Critics argued that Washington had poured money into Afghanistan faster than the country could realistically absorb it. Corruption flourished. Powerful local figures manipulated contracts. Resources vanished into networks nobody could fully control. And while billions flowed overseas, debates inside America intensified. Many citizens began asking why so much money was being spent abroad while problems at home remained unresolved. The longer the war lasted, the harder these questions became to ignore. By the mid-2010s, something unusual had happened. America was still fighting a major war, but emotionally, much of the country had moved on. War fatigue spread quietly. The Afghanistan conflict no longer dominated national conversation the way it had after September 11th. News cycles focused on elections, economic crises, social tensions, and political scandals instead. For younger Americans, the war almost felt permanent, like background noise that never disappeared. This created a dangerous disconnect. Troops continued fighting and dying overseas while public attention faded at home. And because there was no draft, most families never directly experienced the burden of war personally. Only a small percentage of Americans carried the overwhelming weight of repeated military service. Some analysts later argued this allowed the conflict to continue far longer than previous wars. There was anger, there was frustration, but there was never enough public pressure to force immediate withdrawal. The war simply continued in the background of American life, quietly, endlessly. At the center of America's strategy was one massive belief. If Afghanistan could become stable and democratic, extremist groups would lose power. On paper, the vision sounded hopeful. New schools, new elections, rights for women, economic development, modern institutions, and in some cities, real progress did happen. Millions of girls gained access to education. Media expanded. Urban life changed dramatically compared to Taliban rule in the 1990s. A new generation grew up experiencing freedoms many Afghans had never known before. But outside major cities, reality remained far more fragile. Afghanistan was not a unified nation in the Western sense many policymakers imagined. Tribal identities, regional loyalties, ethnic tensions, and local power structures often mattered more than central government authority. American planners repeatedly underestimated this complexity. They tried to build institutions rapidly inside a country still fractured by decades of conflict. And perhaps most critically, many Afghan citizens saw the government as dependent on foreign military support. That perception weakened legitimacy from the beginning. Because once people believe a government survives only through outside protection, confidence collapses quickly the moment that protection disappears. Which is exactly what happened in 2021. As the war dragged into its second decade, American officials increasingly realized there might not be a military solution. So negotiations began. Ironically, after years of refusing to legitimize the Taliban politically, the United States eventually entered direct talks with them. This marked a huge turning point because it signaled something unspoken but obvious. America wanted out. The Taliban understood this immediately, and during negotiations, they gained enormous leverage simply by waiting. The resulting agreements focused heavily on U.S. troop withdrawal timelines. But critics warned that the Afghan government itself was being sidelined during these discussions. That created panic among many Afghan officials who feared America was preparing to leave regardless of conditions on the ground. Meanwhile, Taliban fighters continued gaining territory and influence. Morale inside Afghan security forces weakened. Many soldiers began doubting whether their government would survive after U.S. support disappeared. And once doubt spreads through an army, collapse can happen frighteningly fast. When the final withdrawal accelerated in 2021, American intelligence assessments varied widely. Some believed the Afghan government could survive months after U.S. departure. Others feared quicker collapse. Few predicted just how rapidly everything would unravel. Province after province surrendered. In some areas, Afghan troops abandoned positions without major fighting. Taliban advances became unstoppable. Then came Kabul. The capital fell with astonishing speed. President Ashraf Ghani fled the country. Government institutions collapsed almost overnight. And suddenly, scenes of chaos exploded across global media. Desperate civilians packed airport runways. Families begged foreign troops for evacuation. People clung to aircraft in horrifying attempts to escape. For many Americans, the images felt deeply familiar, painfully similar to the fall of Saigon during the end of the Vietnam War. A superpower leaving after years of conflict while allies scrambled desperately behind. The symbolism was devastating. This question still sparks fierce debate today. Supporters of the war argue the United States achieved important goals. Al-Qaeda's core leadership was severely weakened. Osama bin Laden was killed. Another large-scale attack from Afghan territory was prevented for many years. Millions of Afghans experienced expanded freedoms during the American presence. But critics argue the final outcome exposed a painful truth. After 20 years, the Taliban returned to power anyway. And if the original enemy ultimately regained control, many people believe that can only be described as defeat. Others argue the deeper problem was never military failure alone. It was strategic confusion. America entered Afghanistan with one mission, then slowly transformed the conflict into something much larger and far more complicated. Counterterrorism became nation-building. Nation-building became counterinsurgency. Counterinsurgency became stability management. And eventually, the objectives became so broad that no clear endpoint existed anymore. The war drifted. And drift in war can be deadly. The Afghanistan War will likely be studied for generations, not only because of its length, but because it revealed the limits of power in the modern world. The United States could overthrow governments with astonishing speed, but building lasting political stability proved infinitely harder. Technology could eliminate targets, but could not automatically create trust. Military victories could clear territory, but they could not erase corruption, tribal divisions, or historical grievances overnight. The war also exposed how fear can shape national policy for decades. After September 11th, American leaders believed another catastrophic attack had to be prevented at all costs. That fear drove decisions year after year. And once a country commits enormous blood and treasure into war, leaving becomes psychologically and politically difficult, especially when leaders fear being remembered as the person who lost the conflict. In the end, Afghanistan became more than a battlefield. It became a warning about mission creep, about endless war, about the dangers of entering conflicts without a clear exit strategy, and about how even the most powerful nations can become trapped by their own decisions. For 20 years, Afghanistan shaped global politics, military strategy, and millions of human lives. Children grew up under war. Soldiers spent entire careers fighting in the same mountains. Presidents came and went. Promises changed, strategies changed, but the conflict remained. And perhaps the most haunting reality is this. Many of the people who died in Afghanistan were born after the war had already begun. That is how long it lasted. Today, the ruins of that conflict still echo across the world. Veterans continue carrying invisible wounds. Afghan civilians continue facing uncertainty. Political leaders continue debating what should have been done differently, and historians continue searching for answers to questions that may never fully disappear. Could the war have ended earlier? Was victory ever truly possible? Did fear after September 11th push America into a conflict too large to control? Or was staying in Afghanistan inevitable once the first troops entered? The answers remain complicated, but one truth is impossible to deny. The Afghanistan War became one of the defining stories of the 21st century, not because America entered the war, but because after entering, it could no longer find a clear way out.